Clarissa Brooks had never been one to seek out conflict, but she had also never been one to walk away from it. After nearly 2 decades of working with the National Apiary and Agricultural Risk Assessment Program, she had developed a quiet reputation as one of the agency's most meticulous field inspectors and expert who understood not only the science behind pollination systems, but also the political sensitivities that often surrounded land use, biodiversity programs, and federal conservation zones. Her assignments had taken her across the country, from drought-stricken Californian almond orchards to rooftop installations in the Bronx, but in recent years, Clarissa had grown weary of the travel and the bureaucracy, and even more so of the performative green initiatives that existed only for press releases and not for real environmental impact. So, when a long-term leave was offered to her, part of an internal federal initiative encouraging field specialists to rotate into part-time regional consulting, she took it without hesitation. She chose not to relocate to another city or to a coast lined with laboratories and government campuses. Instead, she returned to her grandfather's old homestead in South Carolina, nestled on the edge of an unincorporated development just beyond the boundary of a fast-expanding suburb. The house itself had been standing there since the 1950s, and though it was modest by modern standards, single-story, wide porch, faded brick walls that stood on nearly 3 acres of land bordered on one side by a sloping tree line and on the other by a rarely maintained gravel access road that led to a disused fire lane. It was quiet, removed, and more importantly, the property had been grandfathered in under agricultural zoning exceptions that made it one of the only plots in the area where a personal apiary could be established without direct municipal review. It was, in Clarissa's view, the perfect place to step back, recalibrate, and continue meaningful work, not through desk audits or policy drafts, but with her hands in the dirt, her eyes on the combs, and her mind grounded in the rhythms of real ecological labor. She installed the first hive within 2 weeks of arriving. It was a Langstroth model with reinforced ventilation, tested for temperature durability, and equipped with a digital sensor unit linked directly to her mobile dashboard. She positioned it along the northeast quadrant of the yard, near the tree line, where native flowering shrubs grew untamed and wild. She added 2 nucleus colonies shortly after a mix of Carniolan and Buckfast strains sourced from a clean breeder in Georgia, both certified disease-free and tagged through the federal traceability program. Clarissa didn't just keep bees, she built monitored ecosystems. Each addition was logged in a federal database, complete with GPS coordinates, health assessments, and regulatory compliance tags. Everything she did was above board. Every panel, every bracket, every yard of electric mesh fencing surrounding the hives was installed by code, checked against both state guidelines and federal inspection standards. She maintained her records meticulously. Her ID was current. Her credentials were valid and recognized across multiple state lines. There was, by any legal or biological standard, nothing remotely questionable about her setup. For the first few weeks, everything remained peaceful. She spent her mornings maintaining the property and inspecting brood frames, her afternoons reviewing soil data and pollen loads. Occasionally, she would sit on the porch with a cup of chicory coffee, watching the sun hang heavy over the distant rows of pine. A few neighbors would wave as they walked by, mostly older couples, retirees, or passive weekenders. No one said much. She didn't volunteer personal information, and they didn't seem to pry. There was a calm about the place, a kind of tacit understanding that silence was a form of respect. She appreciated that. People talked a lot in the cities, too much, too loud, too often about nothing. Out here, the space between conversations felt more meaningful than the words themselves. For someone who had spent the last several years mediating between landowners and regulators, farmers and auditors, lobbyists and activists, the quiet felt like exhalation after holding breath for far too long. It was on the 22nd day after she had finalized her installation Clarissa remembered, because she had just logged a successful queen replacement protocol, that she found the envelope pinned to her gate. It was a thick, semi-gloss paper with a strange, almost performative formality to it. And printed in large serif type across the top was a header that read Community Environmental Oversight Notice. There was no return address, no contact name, and the entire message was constructed in stiff, vaguely legalistic language that cited concerns regarding her property. It stated that a recent site observation has led to the preliminary classification of biohazardous activity related to unmanaged pollinator attractant sources and demanded that all active hives and associated enclosures be voluntarily decommissioned and removed within 72 hours to avoid further procedural escalation. No signatures, no contact numbers, just that and a postscript advising her to consult local ordinances before initiating any challenge to the notice. It was as amateurish as it was threatening. The language was loaded but vague. The authority was implied but unsubstantiated. Clarissa's immediate instinct wasn't fear but irritation, mild, slow-burning, intellectual irritation, the kind that tickled the back of her jaw and made her stand a little straighter. She'd seen these kinds of documents before, community pseudo-legal printouts often used to intimidate new property owners, particularly those who operated outside the unspoken aesthetic codes of local neighborhood associations. It was paper posturing. But what caught her attention, what made the heat rise a few degrees, was the phrase unmanaged. That word wasn't random. It had a technical meaning in regulatory language. And someone had chosen it deliberately. Clarissa didn't panic. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she walked back to her house, opened her laptop, and began drafting a compliance summary to submit to her agency. The summary included time-stamped installation photos, breed records, field assessment notes, and a notarized land use affidavit from her original application. She flagged the notice as a potential unlawful interference in federally registered biological infrastructure and submitted it through the agency's internal report system. She knew it wouldn't trigger immediate action, it wasn't designed to, but it would create a record, and records mattered, especially when people started playing games with definitions. As a field inspector, she had learned early that it wasn't always about being right. It was about being prepared when the wrong people tried to twist the rules in their favor. By the time the sun had started to drop below the trees, casting long amber streaks across the property, Clarissa had archived the submission, printed 3 backup copies of her original federal licensing certificate, and laminated her permit card. She then sat on her porch, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote in block letters on the top page, "Pattern begins at provocation. We assume escalation." Below that, she added, "Watch the language. Someone knows how to speak our dialect." That night, she didn't sleep well, not because of fear, but because her mind was already running ahead. Who had access to enough language to mimic federal phrasing but lacked the confidence to sign the letter? Who knew enough about bee colonies to suggest removal without referencing specific laws? And perhaps most importantly, why now? She had been quiet, respectful, invisible. She had built nothing large or garish, made no noise, kept her boundaries. The only visible sign of her work was a neat wooden placard next to the hives that read Certified Pollinator Support Site USDA affiliated. And yet, something had triggered this letter. Something had shifted the air in her direction. She didn't know who had sent the notice. But she had a very good feeling they would come back. And next time, they might be bolder. Clarissa didn't fear confrontation, but she understood its cadence, its cold logic. It never arrived with a full orchestra. It started with a single note, a knock, a whisper, a document slid across a table. And she was listening now. Every movement, every shadow, every word. Because someone had struck the first note. And she was already composing the counterpoint. The next morning began like any other, quiet, humid, heavy, with the scent of honeysuckle creeping through the tree line. Clarissa rose early, as she always did, tending first to the 2 nucleus colonies she had isolated following the first indication of foreign tampering. The bees were calm, the entrance activity normal, and the pheromone levels inside the hives read within optimal range. She checked the pollen traps, made a note about minor yellowing on one of the brood frames, and recorded a short voice memo for herself to retest mite thresholds by the end of the week. As she brushed pollen dust from her gloves and made her way back toward the house, she paused briefly by the mailbox, more out of habit than expectation. Inside was a second envelope, this one smaller, with a red stripe printed diagonally across the corner. The address was typed in clean font, and the return name was a vague acronym, RERA Regional Environmental Risk Authority. Clarissa's brow furrowed slightly as she opened it. She hadn't heard of RERA in any official capacity, and she'd been in the business long enough to know every real agency by heart. The letter inside was a single page, more professionally formatted than the last, and written in a tone that was neither overtly aggressive nor particularly friendly. It informed her that a routine aerial biodiversity survey had flagged her property for investigation into potential ecosystem destabilization caused by unmanaged pollinator clustering. The letter went on to state that community-level alerts had been raised, and that an on-site pre-assessment visit would occur without the need for appointment, as authorized under neighborhood contingency guidelines. There was no date listed, no name, just that, a visit, without notice, authorized by an unknown regulation and an equally unknown body. Clarissa walked inside, closed the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. She placed the letter in front of her and didn't touch it again for several minutes. Instead, she picked up her phone and began cross-checking acronyms against known regional and federal registries. RERA didn't exist in any database she could access, not as an oversight body, not as an agricultural authority, not even as a shell contractor. It was manufactured. A front. The language in the letter was clever, though careful enough to imply environmental due process without triggering any recognizable legal obligations. It wasn't a real agency, but it was designed to sound like one to anyone unfamiliar with actual regulatory frameworks. The reference to a biodiversity survey was particularly irritating. She had seen no flyovers recently, and FAA-mandated reports for drone activity in the area were required to be public. She logged into the airspace tracker she used for her own fieldwork and checked for any unauthorized UAS activity within the past 30 days. Nothing, no reports, no filings, which meant that whoever had written the letter was lying, or worse, deliberately manufacturing a fictitious paper trail. Rather than escalate directly, Clarissa took the more measured route. She submitted an inquiry to the county clerk's office requesting any registration filings or business licenses under the name RERA or its listed postal box. While she waited, she drafted a formal cease and desist template under the Agricultural Systems Integrity Act, preemptively prepared in case someone physically entered her property without credentials. She also prepared a printed version of her federal field clearance, laminated and clipped it to her fence post near the apiary entrance, along with a notice citing U.S. Code 7 SS 7711 Prohibition of Unauthorized Movement of Regulated Articles. This wasn't overkill, it was defensive signaling. The kind you only had to use when someone was attempting to play a long game of intimidation masked as community concern. She knew the signs. She'd audited enough rogue agricultural zones to recognize what it looked like when someone tried to force compliance without using legitimate legal mechanisms. It was the paper equivalent of walking around your yard in a security vest hoping the neighbors wouldn't question your authority. Only this time they were using mail, made-up institutions, and the vague threat of unannounced visits. The following day, Clarissa took her dog, a lean black mutt named Jackson, for an early walk around the perimeter of the property. As they circled near the back fence, Jackson froze suddenly, nose pointed toward a cluster of overgrowth by the tool shed. Clarissa stepped forward carefully, noting the flattened grass and disturbed mulch near the edge. She crouched. There, half buried under the brush, was a small round plastic disc. At first it looked like a toy or maybe some kind of pest repeller, but a closer look revealed a tiny mesh grill and a lead flickered deep inside the casing. It was a sound-emitting device, low-frequency, non-lethal, but specifically designed to disrupt swarm behavior in certain insects. Clarissa had seen one before during a commercial hive investigation in Arizona. They weren't illegal, but they weren't sold over the counter either. Whoever had planted it wasn't just trying to intimidate her, they were actively trying to destabilize the hives. Clarissa didn't panic, and she didn't call 911. Instead, she used her agency's field escalation channel to file a formal interference report, attaching photographs, GPS coordinates, and a brief analysis of the device's function. She placed the device in a sterile containment bag and locked it in her old inspection case under the floorboards in her office. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. Within 48 hours, she received a call not from the sheriff's office, but from a contact she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Martin Lopez, Senior Field Risk Coordinator with the Department of Agricultural Enforcement, left a message on her encrypted line. His tone was brisk but pointed. Saw your submission. Unregistered interference tech within a live pollination zone isn't a minor issue. You want support. Say the word. But you should know this one might be layered. We've had 2 similar incidents north of you in the last 6 months. No confirmed suspects, but patterns emerging. That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Later that evening, Clarissa reviewed her internal agency logs and found both referenced incidents. Both involved medium-sized residential communities attempting to pressure property owners into dismantling lawful installations, one an aquaponics greenhouse, the other a certified composting operation. Both had started with anonymous letters, followed by targeted complaints citing ambiguous community safety concerns. Both escalated into minor sabotage. In one case, the property owner backed down and sold. In the other, the owner pushed back, but local enforcement did nothing, citing insufficient evidence. Clarissa realized then that she wasn't just dealing with local discontent. She was dealing with a method, an organized, repeatable model of soft elimination through psychological attrition and vague regulatory pressure. That night, she updated her will, not because she feared for her life, but because clarity in her experience was the best armor. Then she sent a short message to Lopez, I'm not folding. Let me know if escalation happens elsewhere. I'll hold my ground here. She went to bed late, Jackson curled at her feet, the air thick with storm hint and pine resin. Somewhere beyond the window, the hum of the hives continued, steady, indifferent, eternal. But inside Clarissa's mind, the real hum had begun the sharp, low thrum of calculated resistance, readying itself for the next move. By the end of that week, the rhythm of Clarissa's days had shifted from meditative routine to quiet anticipation. She no longer moved through her tasks with unguarded calm. Each inspection of the apiary was accompanied by subtle checks of the perimeter, quick glances at the fence line, and mental logs of what items had been moved or disturbed. Jackson, sensitive as ever to her internal weather, had become more alert as well, often stopping mid-walk to scan the surroundings before resuming his circuit. It wasn't paranoia, not the kind that bends the mind into irrational suspicion, but rather a methodical awareness, the kind born of a professional who understood that real threats don't announce themselves in dramatic gestures. They seep in. They test boundaries slowly, waiting for the moment when a response becomes a reaction and a mistake is made. And Clarissa didn't make mistakes. She had learned that the hard way years ago, when a misfiled set of contamination reports had nearly shut down a legitimate organic operation and forced a lawsuit that dragged on for 3 years. Ever since, she'd trained herself to move deliberately, to stay 5 moves ahead, and never assume the other side was as incompetent as they appeared. That Saturday, while she was reviewing data logs from the pollen sensors, her neighbor across the road, a man named Howard Langley, retired police dispatcher, generally pleasant in a forced suburban way, approached the edge of her driveway. He didn't come through the gate, but stood just outside it, arms crossed awkwardly over his stomach. Clarissa noticed him through the window and stepped outside, clipboard still in hand. He didn't wave. He nodded. Then said, Hey, thought you should know. Someone from the council asked about your hives yesterday. Wanted to know if I'd noticed any odd behavior around here lately. He glanced down at the gravel beneath his boots, as if ashamed to have passed on the message. I told him no, because there hasn't been. Not from you, anyway. Clarissa raised an eyebrow. Did they give a name? Howard shook his head. Just said they were from an oversight subcommittee. I didn't catch a badge, nothing official looking. But they seemed organized. Had a clipboard with your property printed on it, like it was a file. Clarissa thanked him, asked if he could write down the time and date of the conversation, and said nothing more. After he left, she went back inside, opened her field journal, and under a fresh heading titled Externals Observation Phase, began recording the exchange in full detail. That night, as a storm rolled in from the west and the trees swayed under the weight of rising humidity, Clarissa woke to the sound of tapping on the porch. Not knocking, just a rhythmic, deliberate series of taps like fingers on glass or rubber soles shifting across planks. Jackson was already on his feet, low growl vibrating in his chest. Clarissa moved carefully, avoiding the creaking floorboards she knew too well, and stepped silently toward the front door. Through the side window, she saw the outline of a person in a hooded jacket standing near the railing, half concealed by the rain-heavy shadows. They weren't moving anymore, just standing, facing the apiary. Clarissa didn't turn on the porch light. Instead, she raised her phone, snapped 2 photos through the glass, then moved to the side window and watched as the figure finally turned and walked away, disappearing down the unlit gravel road. She stayed awake until dawn, cataloging everything: timestamps, weather conditions, security footage, infrared snapshots from the external motion sensor array. It wasn't dramatic. It was documentation. 2 days later, the escalation arrived not at her door but in her inbox. A formal notification from the Community Development Alliance, an entity she hadn't heard of until that moment, stating that a public safety complaint had been filed against her property for high-density allergen cultivation and failure to maintain compliant biological boundaries. The language was worse this time. Phrases like compounding threat factors, non-participatory residents, and potential impact on juvenile pulmonary stability peppered the document with the kind of fear-mongering that no real agency would dare to use without substantiation. Attached was a digital rendering of her property with red overlay shading the entire eastern quadrant, the apiary zone marked as critical concern zone. What truly caught her eye, though, was a line at the bottom: "This notice is preliminary and intended to facilitate voluntary corrective action. Should compliance not be initiated within 5 business days, municipal enforcement avenues may be considered." Municipal enforcement. That was no longer vague bureaucracy. That was a threat of legal action, civil penalties, forced remediation, or worse, forced removal under nuisance statutes. Clarissa read the sentence 3 times, let it settle into her bones, then stood up, walked to the closet, and retrieved her field vest. She had never worn it at this property, never needed to, but now she put it on thick canvas lined with inspection ID tags, departmental insignia, and her embedded biometric pass. She activated the embedded locator chip, confirming her identity to the federal system, then composed an encrypted email to Lopez with the subject line, "P confirmed escalation attempt. Unregistered enforcement language. Document attached. Proceeding with formal engagement." The next morning, she contacted her attorney, Joan Helms, a private environmental litigation expert who had worked on several parallel cases involving illegal zoning manipulations. Joan listened silently as Clarissa explained the sequence of events, then calmly said, "They're probing for silence. If you don't respond, they'll push forward under the assumption you're intimidated or uninformed. We'll initiate a cease and desist framework immediately, all under agricultural sovereignty provisions. But I also want a public notice posted. Not for them. For your neighbors. You need the record to show you're not hiding. You're asserting rights." Clarissa agreed. By afternoon, she had printed and laminated a 3-page document summarizing her federal registration, the full scope of her property's ecological designation, and the penalties for unlawful interference. She posted it on a weatherproof board by her fence, alongside a QR code linking to a copy of the official USDA pollinator support registration. That evening, as she was refilling a feeder tray, she noticed the same child from 3 houses down, little girl, maybe 9 years old, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the hives. Clarissa offered a wave. The girl didn't wave back. Instead, she called out, "My mom said your bugs are dangerous. She said you're not supposed to have them." Clarissa crouched beside the feeder and replied, "Your mom's worried. That's okay. But these aren't just bugs. They help the trees, the flowers, even the vegetables you eat. They don't hurt anyone if they're left alone." The girl looked skeptical, then asked, "Are you sure they won't sting me?" Clarissa smiled, tired but sincere. "I'm sure." The girl nodded once, then ran off. Clarissa watched her go, and the weight in her chest grew heavier, not from fear, but from the recognition that her isolation was deepening. The campaign against her wasn't limited to legal angles or paper threats. It was spreading, socially, subtly, across fences and dinner tables, and through the mouths of children who didn't yet know they were being weaponized. 3 nights later, someone cut a section of her external mesh fencing. It was surgical clean, deliberate, no signs of clumsiness or panic. The opening wasn't wide enough for theft, just large enough to allow for intrusion. Clarissa didn't report it to local police. She sent the photographic evidence directly to her agency and her attorney, and began preparing for the next phase. The game was no longer theoretical. Someone had crossed the line, not to sabotage the hives directly, but to test her response to see if she would flinch, retreat, or escalate too quickly. But Clarissa didn't flinch. She fortified. And she waited. Because whatever this was, whoever was pulling the strings, they hadn't expected her to be someone trained, not just to defend ecological systems, but to survive inside attacks on them. A week passed without a single notice, appearance, or confrontation, but Clarissa knew better than to trust the silence. In her experience, the quiet before an institutional strike was never a sign of retreat. It was the retraction of breath before another push, the pulling back of curtains before a stage reveal. During those days, she maintained a meticulous rhythm, balancing hive work with legal preparation, keeping her interactions with neighbors cordial but distant, and continuing to report every anomaly to Joan and the agency in concise, well-documented bursts. She had become, in essence, her own field office, 1 woman, 5 hives, and a perimeter woven not just with mesh and timber, but with layered defense, legal, procedural, intellectual. Yet even with her diligence, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real attack had yet to arrive, that everything before now had been choreography, meant to test how much she would tolerate before pushing back hard enough to expose herself to counterclaims. The breakthrough came not through a confrontation, but through a mistake someone else's. Joan had requested access to the municipal construction permit database as part of her preparation for a defense filing. In it, she uncovered a minor zoning variance filed 6 months prior by a local development group operating under the name Hilltop Expansion Group LLC, a nondescript title if there ever was one. The request was vague, but one clause listed anticipated conversion of residual residential lots into mixed community access spaces pending cooperative negotiation. On its own, the language meant little, but cross-referenced with the map of projected development boundaries provided by Clarissa's agency in a previous environmental impact report, it was clear her land sat on a corner lot that, if acquired or neutralized, would allow uninterrupted access between the newer subdivision and a planned municipal park. In practical terms, her property was a bottleneck. With it, access was private and limited. Without it, the project could proceed openly, increasing land value, connectivity, and most importantly, profit for anyone holding contracts tied to that corridor. Clarissa sat with Joan for 2 hours going over the implications. No, there was no explicit reference to her address. No, nothing in the paperwork proved malicious intent. But combined with the pattern of soft threats, false authorities, and escalating intimidation, it fit the profile perfectly. Joan was calm, surgical in her assessment. "You're not dealing with amateurs," she said. "You're dealing with people who know how to move quietly inside the system. They use legal gray zones, social manipulation, and incremental pressure. Their goal isn't to win in court. Their goal is to exhaust you until you make the choice they want." Clarissa didn't respond at first. She looked at the blueprint printouts, the lines drawn over her land like surgical incisions, and realized just how deliberate this entire process had been. The hives weren't the problem. They were the pretext. A convenient, credible excuse for starting a public campaign against her while concealing the real objective: clearance. That night, as the sky flushed dark with pre-storm tension and thunder rolled low in the distance like distant machinery, Clarissa walked the property line. Her boots moved silently through the tall grass as Jackson followed a few paces behind. She checked every post, every sensor, every stretch of mesh. Everything was intact. Yet as she stood at the northern edge of the lot, facing the rise that led toward the back of the undeveloped greenbelt, she noticed something different, an unfamiliar pattern in the undergrowth. Not vandalism, not damage, just space, flattened earth where none had been before. Square, measured. Someone had been testing sightlines. Standing there, measuring visibility. Clarissa stepped into the depression, stood still, and looked back toward her own home. From here, the apiary was visible through a narrow gap in the trees, barely, but just enough. She had chosen the site for isolation, not for concealment. And now that decision left her exposed. The next morning, Clarissa sent a formal notification to her federal liaison requesting a proactive compliance inspection. It was an aggressive move, essentially inviting the federal agency to inspect her already sanctioned operation, knowing full well it would come back clean. But that was the point. It would create a fresh, unimpeachable record of regulatory alignment, one that no community organization could publicly dispute without exposing their own negligence or deceit. The inspection was scheduled for 5 days later. The same afternoon, Clarissa received an anonymous package on her doorstep. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with a single sentence typed in large black font: "They won't stop until you're gone." Beneath it, a laminated photo of a collapsed beehive burned, blackened, swarmed by hornets. The photo wasn't of her property, but it didn't need to be. Clarissa didn't flinch. She logged the evidence, scanned for fingerprints, none, and forwarded it to Joan, who added it to the growing file. Then she returned to her hives. She worked slowly, deliberately, cleaning frames, inspecting brood patterns, testing for parasites. Her movements were calm, precise, deeply rooted in a discipline that no amount of intimidation could shake. It was a ritual, a defiance, a refusal to yield her space, not just the land, but the mental territory that fear attempts to claim first. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't vigilance or weariness. It was resolve, cold, clear, and deeply embedded. They wanted exhaustion. She would give them endurance. They wanted fear. She would give them documentation, strategy, escalation. 5 days later, the federal inspector arrived, not in secret, not in a marked vehicle, but in a plain SUV with full ID, clipboard, and agency windbreaker. A quiet man named Price, mid-40s, meticulous and no-nonsense. He walked the grounds with Clarissa, took photos, reviewed records, asked questions. She provided everything: the installation logs, the hive health data, her property zoning history, even the soil reports from the local conservation office. He said little. He wrote constantly. And when he finished, he looked up from his clipboard and said, "No violations. Not even minor ones. This is textbook." Clarissa nodded. "That's the idea." Price paused. "You expecting trouble?" She met his gaze evenly. "I'm already in it." The next day, Clarissa laminated the final inspection report and posted it beside her gate next to the USDA placard. Beneath it, she stapled a copy of the email summary sent by Price's office, verifying the integrity of her apiary and declaring no further review necessary. It was a wall not of fences or bricks, but of facts, of clean regulatory lines drawn in public view. For anyone watching, it was a signal she would not be bullied into quiet departure. The land was hers. The bees were lawful, and whatever their endgame, she had just made it harder for them to reach it. 3 days after the federal inspector's clean report was publicly posted on her gate, the next strike arrived not as a document, not as an official letter or digital message, but as noise, subtle at first, but calculated. It began at precisely 4:m. A mechanical whine rising from the far end of the access road that bordered the southern boundary of Clarissa's property. The sound, thin and high-pitched, wasn't immediately alarming. It could have been a generator, a delivery vehicle, perhaps some early maintenance project unrelated to her land. But as it persisted, droning like an unchecked frequency, Clarissa rose from bed, threw on her boots, and stepped outside. The morning was still black with pre-dawn mist, and the fog hung low across the fields like a warning. As she walked toward the sound, Jackson at her side, the outline of a tall, narrow machine came into view parked just beyond the community boundary marker, though its operator nowhere in sight. It was a portable pesticide sprayer, the kind used for broadleaf treatment or mosquito fogging, humming on idle with its chemical reservoir depressurized but full. Its nozzle faced the slope of her property. Clarissa stood still, eyes narrowing. Someone had delivered it, left it running, and disappeared. A threat with plausible deniability, perfectly placed. She snapped a series of photos, careful to document the serial number, the surrounding tracks in the dirt, the angle of deployment. Then she powered it down, pulled the battery clip, and called Joan. By the time Clarissa returned to the house, she already knew the headlines of the next maneuver. The sprayer, while not actively engaged, had been placed on the edge of an area designated as an undeveloped transitional zone in the subdivision plans uncovered earlier by Joan. That meant anyone could claim it had been staged there temporarily as part of routine land maintenance. But its orientation, its model, and its unregistered placement within 70 feet of an active apiary all suggested something else. This wasn't just mischief. It was a rehearsal. Clarissa filed an official interference complaint to the Environmental Hazard Division under Section 18.221 of the Controlled Dispersal Act, noting potential endangerment of protected biological assets. Meanwhile, Joan began assembling a legal response package that included a formal restraining request against unknown agents operating under the aegis of community development initiatives. They weren't naming names yet. That would come later. But the intent was clear: build pressure, create fatigue, and force Clarissa into an unsustainable defense posture. What they hadn't accounted for was that Clarissa, unlike most of their past targets, had institutional memory. She didn't just fight back. She archived, countered, and escalated with documentation they couldn't easily dismiss. 2 days after the sprayer incident, Clarissa received a certified letter from a local private compliance firm, Brenner Morgan Regulatory Services, stating that a complaint had been submitted regarding her non-compliance with local habitat integration guidelines. The letter accused her of maintaining unnatural perimeter visual structures, i.e., her fencing, of disrupting the aesthetic flow of the adjoining residential design language, and, more importantly, of failing to submit a community integration plan for high-risk ecological installations. It was nonsense, legally void, jurisdictionally baseless, but dressed in enough bureaucratic costume to appear credible to a layperson. She scanned the letter, forwarded it to Joan, then pulled up the firm's public registry filing. It had been incorporated less than 3 months earlier, with no listed partners and a business address linked to a law office that specialized in land transfers. Another shell. Another play. But this time, they weren't just targeting her operational footprint. They were trying to delegitimize her entire presence. Joan responded fast. A counter letter was drafted, served, and published to the local registrar with the full weight of Clarissa's federal credentials behind it. Simultaneously, Clarissa submitted an affidavit to the Office of State Agricultural Sovereignty requesting a formal record of external attempts to modify or undermine her site designation. The response was swift: a confirmation receipt, a reference number, and an internal inquiry assigned to a regional compliance officer. Clarissa knew this wouldn't stop the harassment, but now the bureaucracy had teeth. Her opposition wasn't just pushing paper anymore. They were being entered into systems that tracked accountability. Still, the attacks continued, now layered with social aggression. Flyers began appearing on community boards and in mailboxes anonymous, unsigned, filled with vague warnings about uncontained allergen sites, safety violations, and irregular chemicals. The word hazard was bolded throughout, paired with grainy photos taken at extreme angles of Clarissa's hives, fence line, and porch. One photo showed her through the kitchen window, blurry, but unmistakably her. In that one chilled her. Not because of the surveillance, but because of the message it carried: we're watching everything. Clarissa responded the only way she knew how. She contacted her agency's security liaison and submitted the photos under code protocol, targeted surveillance against federal field agents. She didn't care if they were local vigilantes, hired provocateurs, or developers hiding behind law firms. They had crossed a line. Joan took it further. She filed an injunction request under grounds of sustained targeted harassment and civil disruption of certified agricultural infrastructure. The filing named unidentified agents operating in service of commercial interests, and requested provisional restrictions on any entity engaging in third-party enforcement attempts. A hearing was scheduled for 10 days later. That same week, Clarissa's property was cited illegally for an excessive vegetation growth notice, accusing her of harboring overgrowth in violation of fire safety regulations. The citation was posted on her gate, laminated, printed in bold. Clarissa checked the coordinates listed on the notice. They were incorrect by over 400 feet. The fire zone they claimed was overgrown wasn't even part of her lot. She documented the error, filed a fraud complaint with the county assessor's office, and submitted a request for retraction. But the message was received. They weren't concerned with legality. They were counting on exhaustion. Then came the children. Clarissa noticed them first near the apiary line: 2 boys, roughly 10 or 11, throwing small stones at the fencing. When she stepped outside and called out, they bolted. A week later, a group of teens walked past her property at dusk, shouting about bug bombs and killer bees. It was theater, poorly staged, but part of the same campaign: isolate her, demonize her, make her the subject of dinner table gossip and side street suspicion. Clarissa remained silent. She didn't engage. Instead, she installed new motion sensors, updated the camera system, and forwarded the footage to her agency. Then she submitted a third escalation notice, this time with a full timeline, tying each attack to a probable financial interest in the corridor expansion plan. She wasn't just pushing back. She was building a wall of evidence, one data point at a time. In the middle of it all, Price, her federal inspector, reached out again. "We've had another case," he said. "Same pattern, composting site in Missouri. Legal. Certified. Got run off with fake compliance claims. Now we're tracking a consulting group linked to all 3 events." Clarissa asked if they had a name. He replied, "It's loose, but we think they subcontract through shell enforcement firms." Brenner Morgan came up. Clarissa felt the click in her mind, the thread tightening. She thanked him and updated her dossier. Then she sat on her porch, pen in hand, and wrote a single line across the page in her field journal. They moved the fight to the social plane. We escalate to structural. She knew now that this wasn't just about pushing her off her land. It was about precedent. Her resistance, if successful, would disrupt a profitable method: soft elimination through technical confusion and communal pressure. But if she failed, it would validate the model. Her victory wasn't personal anymore. It was tactical, and the next move, whatever it was, had to carry weight. She closed her journal, fed Jackson, and sat in the dusk until the last light vanished. The war wasn't over. It had just changed format. The morning of the injunction hearing arrived under a bleached gray sky, the air dense and unmoving, as though the weather itself had paused in anticipation. Clarissa, dressed with clinical precision pressed slacks, dark blazer, a clean shirt bearing the agency crest stitched into the cuff just below her wrist. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, carried no bag except for a narrow binder containing every document that mattered: aerial photos, complaint records, official letters, time-stamped video stills, legal certifications, and her laminated field clearance card. Jackson watched her leave from the window, ears perked, head tilted. She gave him a quiet nod and walked out, locking the gate behind her. The courthouse was a plain building in the county seat, 2 stories of bureaucratic drywall and aging tile, and the hearing itself was held in a sterile room that smelled faintly of copier toner and hallway coffee. Across the table sat a man representing the firm that had issued the most recent complaints, Brenner Morgan's legal proxy, face pale, suit immaculate, demeanor confident in that performative way people wear when they believe intimidation is still on the table. He didn't meet Clarissa's eyes directly. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for low tolerance toward procedural abuse, opened the hearing by reading the summary aloud. She paused twice, once at the term uncontained allergen propagation and again at the phrase biological instability. Then she looked up and asked a single question. "Do you have proof?" The man across from Clarissa straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and launched into a carefully worded explanation involving community wellness, public concern, and his client's right to preemptively identify hazard-prone installations. The judge raised one eyebrow and cut him off. "Sir, I asked if you had proof. Scientific documentation, photos, test results, anything to substantiate the allegations made against MS. Brooks." He hesitated, opened his folder, and slid forward 3 grainy black and white printouts, low-resolution shots of her hives, and one visibly doctored to include a swarm effect that had never occurred. Clarissa watched silently as the judge examined them, then looked back at her. "MS. Brooks," she said, "do you have documentation?" Clarissa stood, opened her binder, and placed a single document on the table, the federal compliance report authored by Price, signed and dated, verifying full operational legality and biological integrity. Behind it, she laid out the inspection photos, incident log, digital correspondence trail, and drone survey timestamps proving her system had never triggered an ecological breach. The judge reviewed them with methodical calm. When she spoke again, her voice was final. "There is no legal foundation for the complaints filed against this property. This hearing is concluded. MS Brooks, your request for injunctive relief is granted. I will also be referring this matter to the Office of State Licensing for review of fraudulent regulatory practices." Clarissa didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She gathered her papers, nodded respectfully, and left. Outside, the air had shifted. Wind moved through the trees in sudden bursts, scattering dry leaves across the sidewalk. The man from Brenner Morgan exited a few minutes later, speaking urgently into a phone, face drawn tight. He glanced at her once but said nothing. She didn't need him to. The judge's words had landed like a stone through glass, public, irreversible, admissible in any further litigation. A ruling, yes, but also an exposure. An exposure meant leverage. That night, Joan drafted a summary judgment report and submitted it to multiple oversight bodies, including the Agricultural Bureau and the Office of Professional Enforcement Conduct. Clarissa forwarded the same to Price, attaching a note, pattern confirmed. Expansion Group strategy officially ruled fraudulent. Recommend federal inquiry into regional development consultancy links. Price responded with a single line, already in motion. 2 days later, a representative from the original Community Development Alliance rang her bell just after sunset. Clarissa answered the door with her phone in recording mode, visible and obvious. The woman standing there, late 30s, business casual, clipboard in hand, offered a tense smile and extended a brochure about community cohesion planning. Clarissa said nothing. The woman hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "There's still time to be part of the transition phase," she said quietly, as though offering an opportunity. "If you relocate now, you might still qualify for early settlement compensation." Clarissa asked a single question in return. "Are you here on behalf of Hilltop Expansion Group?" The woman froze for half a beat. That was enough. Clarissa raised her phone slightly. "I'll consider this your acknowledgement." The woman turned without another word and walked briskly to her car. Clarissa forwarded the footage to Joan. The next 72 hours moved fast. An anonymous source leaked documents to Joan's office emails between shell contractors, development planners, and a consultant tied to a land acquisition firm operating under the Hilltop umbrella. The communications outlined a strategy labeled Phase Redline, which described a multi-stage process for clearing targeted lots deemed non-compliant with long-term aesthetic and access goals. Clarissa's name was listed under a section titled Projected Resistance Assets, not residents, not owners. Assets, items to be removed. Joan submitted the documents as supplemental evidence in a fraud complaint to the State Attorney General's office. Meanwhile, Clarissa filed a request to freeze any current or future permit activity within a 40,000-foot radius of her parcel pending the outcome of the inquiry. The county office approved the request within the day. By the end of the week, construction signage on the nearby lots had been taken down. Survey markers vanished. Equipment disappeared. Hilltop had gone dark temporarily or permanently, she couldn't yet say. But the stillness was different this time. Not the quiet before action, but the quiet after exposure. They hadn't expected a fight to reach this level. They hadn't expected someone like her. The final blow arrived not from Clarissa or Joan, but from the federal side. Price called late on a Sunday night. 3 linked projects under internal audit, he said. Yours triggered it. Turns out you weren't the only one. We've got a paper trail leading through 5 states and over a dozen properties. The method was nearly identical: false citations, shell regulators, social pressure, an offer to buy exits wrapped in settlement language. Clarissa exhaled slowly. "Are you naming names?" "Not yet," he replied. "But soon." He paused, then added, "You were the first to hold. That changes the precedent." Clarissa didn't respond. She looked out across her yard where the hives stood silent in the moonlight, the air still and cool, the fence line undisturbed. This wasn't victory, it was stabilization. She had stopped the bleeding, contained the threat, and pushed the operation into the light where it could be dissected and dismantled. But she knew how systems worked. She knew this wasn't the end of the game. It was simply the point at which the game changed shape. And whatever form it took next, she would be ready. The quiet that followed the collapse of the development pressure campaign was unlike the tension that had preceded it. It did not feel ominous or strained, nor did it carry the weight of another incoming move. It was heavier in a different way, the quiet of aftermath, of exposed schemes and disrupted ambitions, of strategies cut short before they could ripen into outcomes. Clarissa moved through her days with measured steadiness, no longer expecting conflict around every corner, yet still alert, aware that systems rarely dissolve just because they've been caught. They morph, recede, regroup. She understood this rhythm not only from her time in federal service, but from years observing ecological cycles, how organisms adapted to disruption, how pressure rechanneled into new paths. The attempt to uproot her had failed, yes, but the structure behind it would not vanish overnight, and she had no illusions about the permanence of this momentary calm. She resumed her apiary operations at full scale, reintroducing 2 of the satellite hives she had temporarily relocated during the height of the harassment. The colonies had remained stable, and their reintegration went smoothly. Clarissa adjusted the mesh fencing to a reinforced dual-gate system. Not for protection, but for clarity. The space was monitored, secure, and actively maintained by a federally certified agent. No ambiguity. No false openings. She also submitted an updated site profile to the USDA Pollinator Health Initiative, requesting that her property be designated as a regional demonstration site for integrated community-based pollination models. The proposal was approved 2 weeks later. Clarissa didn't announce it to the neighborhood. She simply replaced the small placard at the apiary's edge with a new one, larger, clearer, bearing the emblem of the federal program and a QR code linking to public resources about pollinator conservation. It wasn't a warning. It was an education. She had decided that whatever her role had once been here, resident, inspector, quiet presence on the edge of a growing suburban cluster, it would now include visible stewardship, not in opposition to those around her, but in honest defiance of the culture that had tried to replace presence with compliance. In the months that followed, a strange kind of reversal took place. Where once she had been the target of suspicion and whispers, she became the object of reluctant curiosity. A few neighbors who had remained silent during the campaign against her now offered cautious greetings. One woman, previously cold, left a note by the gate apologizing for her silence, admitting she had been unsure what was true, and thanking Clarissa for not backing down. Clarissa didn't seek reconciliation. She had no interest in restoring social comfort for those who had allowed aggression to go unchecked, but she acknowledged the note with a nod when their paths crossed. She wasn't interested in punishment. She was interested in consequence, in the presence of accountability, and that, she knew, often required space rather than engagement. Joan closed the legal file 2 months after the ruling, following confirmation that all outstanding citations and fraudulent filings had been nullified, and the investigation into the Hilltop-linked shell companies had advanced to the federal litigation phase. They spoke rarely after that, no need for daily coordination, but when they did, it was with the ease of people who had been through something that required not just professionalism, but shared clarity of purpose. Joan told her once, near the end of it all, most people fold. You didn't. That has a ripple effect. Not just here. Everywhere this method has been tried. Clarissa thanked her, not with flowery language or exaggerated gratitude, but with the kind of simple, grounded sincerity that marked all her interactions. She had not set out to be a model for anything. She had simply refused to be a casualty of someone else's quiet theft. The season turned slowly. Spring gave way to a long, hot summer. The hives flourished. Wildflowers Clarissa had planted along the edges of her land burst into chaotic, vibrant bloom, attracting not only her bees but native species long absent from the area. She began logging the diversity index on a monthly basis, submitting the data to the state's open-source conservation network. She spoke at a regional symposium not about the attack against her but about resilience in decentralized ecological systems, about what happens when pressure is met not with equal force, but with structure, clarity, and precision. She became, to her quiet surprise, something of a case study not in martyrdom, but in successful resistance by procedural mastery. She did not leave the house. She did not sell. She did not retreat into anonymity. She simply kept going. Her life remained private, her routines largely unchanged, but the psychological terrain had shifted. The fence was no longer a boundary against intruders. It was a declaration of presence. The hives were no longer just ecological instruments. They were testament. And her silence, once seen as standoffish, had become something else entirely strategic, grounded, untouchable. Clarissa never heard from the Hilltop Group again. Their projects elsewhere stalled. A handful were repurposed under new ownership. Some vanished. The headlines came and went. Her name was never in them. That she preferred. She had no interest in public vindication. What mattered to her was not being erased. And she hadn't been. Her land, her work, her name in the inspection registries all still there. Undisturbed. On the last evening of September, Clarissa stood by her apiary at twilight, watching as the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the field. Jackson lay at her feet, tail thumping softly. The hum of the hives was steady content. No helicopters, no complaints, no letters. Just the rhythm of bees, the scent of late-season clover, and the wind shifting through the tall grass. Clarissa placed one hand on the fence and breathed in deeply, eyes half closed. The battle had not defined her. The resistance had not consumed her. What had endured was purpose, and that, she knew, was unassailable.